Welcome back. I hope you all had a good lunch. And I hope that this type of presentation is the right one after lunch, where you do not need to be 100% concentrated to get all the technical details out of something. Because I thought, since this year we are celebrating a couple of anniversaries in our PHP ecosystem community, we should take some time and reflect what has happened in the last 30 years. So before lunch, I gave a presentation called Modern PHP Development, where I talked about how PHP development happens today, is done today, but how did we get here? And first of all, so PHP is 30 years old. Who has been using PHP for 30 years? 1, 2. For 25 years. That's some more. 20 years. I should have done the other way around. That's what you're saying. So, okay. My good friend who I've shared the last, how long do we know each other? 25 years? Something like that. So, and he is really good at telling me you're doing something wrong. And that is very valuable, because usually he means it in a nice way. Okay, so how did we get here? Well, what should we do to find out? We need a time machine. Okay, so we need to go back in time. And when I'm not talking, I hear talking from the other room, which sometimes is confusing. Sorry about that. So we traveled back in time 30 years. I'm not naming names now because I want to judge or whatever, but just to give some historic reference, like how long this was ago. So it's 30 years ago, we had Bill Clinton as the US president. Here in Germany, we had Helmut Kohl. Now, whether or not you remember those times for these people as good or bad, that is up to you. In 1995, this is the CPU that I wanted to have, but I could not afford to put into my Amiga 1200. I had a couple of friends who had that. I could not afford that. This is the CPU that most of my friends had, just to give some reference where we are coming from computer history. Also, 30 years ago, this was a film that was showing in the movies, and I quite like that. It's not a movie that inspired me to start programming. That was like 10 years before that. That was War Games. But we're talking about 30 years and not 40 years. And I think I'm already giving enough clues about how old I am without telling you how old I am. Okay, so 1995, Rasmus publishes PHP Tools. And at the time, PHP stood for Personal Homepage. Yeah, and since the internet does not forget, you can still find an archived copy of the email that he sent out to some mailing list or Usenet group, rather, comp infosystems authoring.cgi, where he announced the tool set that he wrote for himself to add a teeny tiny dynamic element to his website, which was his resume, and it was an access counter. Rocket science. But at the time, it was really, really, really hard to do something like that if you did not know C, because you needed to extend, you needed to source code from the web server, you needed to hack your logic in there in C code, compile that, deploy that, and he wanted to alleviate the pain of having to do something like that for other people, and his vision was to have something that is a different. He did not really set out to create a language that only came later, but he wanted to create a solution to make it easy for people who do not know C to add dynamic elements to a website. Yeah, and I put it under the GPL, and it was available there. And I don't think, I did not try, whether or not that domain still works, I don't know. In case you have never seen him, this is what Rasmus looks like, giving a presentation about the history of PHP. So some things in software engineering are always true, there are always trade-offs, and there's always recursion. So I have in my presentation about the history of PHP, Rasmus presenting about the history of PHP. So this is, and here you can see it better, this is what you needed to do in 1993 to add dynamic stuff to a website, and that was not nice. And then at the same time, this is what the Perl world had to offer. And I don't know about you, but I only tried using Perl for like 1 or 2 hours at one point. And I'll get back to that a little bit later when I talk about how I got started with PHP. But for now, suffice it to say, Rasmus was not very happy with that. So he wanted to be able to do something like this. And this is what PHP looked like in 1994, 1995, leading up to the point where he announced it to the public. And you had already these elements that you could put in there. There were no braces. There was this if and the end if. And we still have if and end if and for and end for to this day as syntax constructs in the language. They still work because backward compatibility. But yes, both syntaxes are compiled down to the same bytecode, so they behave exactly the same. I just hope that nobody uses that anymore, at least not when writing new code, because I find that hard to read. But that may just be me. And Rasmus, at that point in time, only thought of PHP as a C API for the web, as a bridge between I want to build software, domain logic, whatever you want to call it, business logic in C, and I want a very convenient way of exposing that logic through a web server to the web. Right? So for instance, if you needed to do some calculations, you could just implement a function in C and expose that as a function that can be used from PHP, and then in PHP you can call that function that is implemented in C, and that is how it all started. So first version, PHP 1, came out in 95. I wasn't around back then, and the internet is a bit fuzzy on when exactly PHP FI came out, which is what would have been PHP 2.0 if it would have been called PHP 2.0. The /FI means forms interpreter, which was the beginning of the subglobals and the superglobals getting information that came through HTTP requests over the wire into the language. That was either late 96 or early 97. What is clear, and that this is when I started using PHP, that was in 1998. PHP 3 came out, and these two guys got involved in the PHP project, and that is one of the first digital photos that I ever took, because I bought my first digital camera, which has a lot of not really nice JPEG artifacts, but that's what we had at the time, especially if you take like a 640 watt by something photo, which was in 2000, maybe not state of the art, but normal for a camera. And you could not make phone calls or access the internet with that camera. I bought that camera before I went to a PHP conference and took a photo of Andy and Zev. And at the time, they were studying computer science in Israel, and they had an assignment to build a compiler. And when they were not at university studying, they were working somewhere at an ISP, and they were using PHP, and they thought, yeah, PHP is nice, but it is really slow. And then they looked into how could it be made faster, and they realized, oh, it doesn't really have a compiler. It's just interpreted line by line, so that's the reason why it's slow. And oh, we can get some points at university if we build a compiler, so they built a compiler for PHP. And the result of that was PHP 3, and that was really quickly shipped. And then the compiler was refined for PHP 4, but we'll get to that in a moment. Around that time, between PHP 3 and PHP 4 was released, people over here in Germany started to build the first really big projects with PHP. That happened at the small company called NetUse in Kiel, Germany, northernmost part of Germany. And they were building a really big application for a big telecommunications company here in Germany. And they really liked PHP. They could get a lot of the stuff done that they needed to get done with that really quickly, and they were very happy with that, but they were missing a couple of things. They were missing, for instance, things like session management. So they built a library called PHP lib, which probably is, at least as far as I know, the oldest library / framework that was developed for PHP and that was professionally used widely in the field. So they built a PHP 3 in userland implementation of session management, and then later on Sascha Schumann took that implementation, that design, and implemented in C as part of what we know as a session extension today, and that started shipping with PHP out of the box, with PHP 4 later. And once again, since the internet does not forget, you find announcements like that still on the net. And I just quoted from there. If you don't believe me, you can look that up. And around that time, for the very first time, people who worked on PHP met for the very first time in real life. Andy and Zev had finished university. They started a company in Israel called Zend. And they invited a couple of people who were very active in the development of PHP at the time, and also some people from MySQL, because the dynamic duo of the time was people were implementing a lot of applications using PHP and MySQL, and it was around that time that the acronym LAMP was coined, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, because that was synonymous with we build a web application. This is another photo, and this is proof that at once upon a time I did have hair on my head. So this is me in 1998, fresh out of high school, like 1 year out of high school, finished high school in 1997, then did military replacement service, civil service here in Germany, and it was a time before I started university. And I was doing an internship at a German research institute, which is now part of the Fraunhofer Group. And I was very bored there because the tasks that they gave me for 3 months, I had completed in like 2 or 3 weeks. And they already told me, yes, that's satisfying, and here is your certificate that you did it well, and now do what you want, find some task to do. And around that time, one of those gentlemen over there that I knew from the Amiga demo scene where I grew up coding and was socialized in team development on software and things like that, said, hey, I'm now doing websites, but you know, I'm only the graphics person, and now I do. Until now, it was good enough to use Photoshop and export it as HTML. Now, a lot of people, even at the time, would disagree whether that is good enough to just use Photoshop and export it as HTML. But for his clients, that was good enough, and they were happy with that. But suddenly, he needed something very dynamic. He needed a platform for a real estate agent, and he was looking for someone to implement the logic on the server for that. And he asked me, because for him, programming is programming, whether or not that's 2D, 3D, real-time graphics on the Amiga in assembly, or server-side programming on the internet. And I had not done anything with that in that area at all up until that point, and basically just asked the question, which programming language is that? What do I need to learn for that? And he said, well, you can do Perl or PHP. So I tried Perl for like 2 or 3 hours, and I don't remember the exact reason, but I very soon stopped wanting to learn that and tried PHP, and the rest is history, as they say. So by the way, in case you do not know, hi, I'm Sebastian. I've been doing things with PHP for a very long time. I can help you introduce PHPUnit into your projects, help you optimizing its use, refining development processes, and help you write more maintainable and testable code. And it was around that time that I got involved not only in building stuff with PHP, because building stuff in PHP required going on the mailing list, asking questions, which soon turned into answering questions. And then I got dragged or invited to contribute to the documentation for PHP, translated from English to German, contribute to the English documentation because there were some features that were not documented yet. And then at some point I realized, okay, the documentation says PHP works like this, but it doesn't work like that. Is there a bug in the documentation or is it a bug in PHP? Turned out it was a bug in PHP. At that point, I looked for the very first time, how is PHP implemented? Oh, it's implemented in C. I know some C, so maybe I can fix that bug. And got involved a bit in PHP development. And then 2000 came and PHP 4 was released. And as I mentioned earlier, that was a big release because it came out of the box with session management, but it was also the first version of PHP that had extension mechanisms, extension points for things like a debugger, a profiler, and things like that, that made things like Xdebug possible. And was also the year where pair started. If you have never heard about pear before, unless it's the fruit, which some people really like, I don't. I prefer apples. But if you have never heard about pear in the PHP context, I envy you. I would really like to use a lot of fire to get rid of it, but it's still around. But jokes aside, and in all fairness, back in 2000, it was a game changer for PHP to finally have a central repository of reusable libraries that were installable using a command line tool. It was nowhere near feature-wise or even philosophy-wise what we would later get with packages in Composer, but it was a good first step. Talking about firsts, until 2019, I thought that I was at the very first PHP conference ever. Turns out I was not, because when I told that story in Japan while I was at the PHP Tokyo conference, they told me, no. Conference in Tokyo was 2 weeks earlier than the one in October 2000 in Cologne. So my knowledge at the moment is that the world's first PHP conference was in Japan in 2000, and the second one was in Cologne. And the conference that happened in October 2000 in Cologne was called PHP Congress. And a year later, it was renamed into International PHP Conference. And a couple of years later, it became a event that happens twice a year, and that is what we still have to this day, and this is the event where you are, or where we are at right now. And this has been a very important event for the PHP ecosystem over the last 25 years. Talking about 25 years, in 2000, I started working on PHPUnit. At the time, I was in the middle of my studies at University for Computer Science. I was involved there in the working group about open object-oriented language design and aspect-oriented programming extensions to existing languages and things like that. And the professor knew that I was doing open source and I was doing a lot of things with PHP. And at university, I was doing things with Java and JUnit, and he noticed that I liked that and that I was missing that for PHP. And in a discussion, I may or may not have said, I bet that this can also be implemented in PHP. And then a week later, I showed him a prototype of what would later become PHPUnit. That must have been at some point in early 2000, but only like months later, brought up the courage, if you will, to share that with the world and put that code out there somewhere, because I was still hoping at the time that somebody else would do that. Somebody else actually did. There is a PHPUnit project on SourceForge, if you still remember SourceForge. But I never could get that to work. It said it's only compatible with PHP 3, and I couldn't get it to work with PHP 4. I even couldn't get it to work with PHP 3. So at some point I said, okay, I need this. I do not want to work without tests. So I just published that and did not expect that 25 years later I would still work on that, and that people would still be interested in that, and people would be still using that. 2002 comes along, and the gentleman in the back started working on Xdebug, released the first version of Xdebug. That's this person over there who's not actively not paying attention. Now he's smiling, now he's hiding. Hello, Derek, thank you. And make it easy to provide utilities when you work with PHP, improves things like var dump and things like that, and also gives you a step debugger that I guess most of us are familiar with. A couple of years later, I was able to convince him to implement support for code coverage so that we could get code coverage reporting in PHPUnit going. That mostly happened while we were both living in Norway in 2006, working for the same company while I was doing my master's thesis there. So that was in 2002. And then at some point, this person started contributing. But before he started contributing to PHP, he implemented an alternative bytecode cache, alternative to, at the time, the only bytecode caching solution that we had for PHP. Remember, I said PHP 4 introduced extension points and APIs for implementing something like a debugger or implementing something like a profiler. It also brought the extension points for doing bytecode caching. And at the beginning, there was only a commercial tool for that from Zend, which was the business model of Andy and Zev, who built the engine for PHP 3 and PHP 4. And he figured out how to build a bytecode cache that was then, I don't remember if it was open source from the beginning, but eventually it was open source, and more people started using that instead of the commercial product. So at some point, Zend made them an offer that he couldn't refuse, and they hired him. And they not only hired him to work on their bytecode cache, but also to work on PHP itself to make PHP faster. 2004 saw the release of PHP 5, on which we worked for quite some time. And now I say we because I brought in a couple of ideas into the language design of PHP 5, things like the reflection API, and for the next one, I need to apologize, __ call, get, and set. I saw that at university in our OO working group. In other languages, where it is sane and can be safely used, and brought that up in a conversation that I had with Marcus and some others, and at some point it was implemented. I've only ever, like most of the time, I see it implemented in a way that we did not imagine, which is abusive and should not be used like that. But we had the best intentions, but this is how language design sometimes goes. Around that time, this article appeared in, and I always mix them up, either Forbes or Fortune. I think this one is from Forbes. And of course, the photo on the right is photoshopped, but it fits the narrative of, hey, here are 4 guys that created something that scares Microsoft in a garage. Yeah, so we have the people behind the behind PHP, Linux, Apache, and MySQL. So that was a time when Microsoft was really scared and stopped making jokes about open source and started thinking about, okay, how can we destroy them, deal with them, whatever. I think by now they have won because they own a lot of what makes up the open source world. They have GitHub, they have Visual Studio Code. But I want to positively reflect on the last 30 years and not open up other sidetracks. Talking about anniversaries, 2005 saw the first release of Symfony. Started as a framework inside a web agency in France, and at some point they decided it would be better for them and it would be better for the community if they open source that and others would contribute to that and start using that. 2006 saw at least the release of the first widely used static analysis tool for PHP, which is PHP Code Sniffer. Greg Sherwood over in Australia started working on that. Originally only to sniff at your code to find where it's not correctly formatted. So all the boring stuff related to whitespace, how the code is formatted. Over time, many more sniffs were implemented that calculate software metrics and other things to tell you, hey, here your code can be improved. 2007 saw the release of Zen Framework 1 because everyone needs a framework and we need more than one. And this email fundamentally changed how PHP is developed. I don't know who of you was in Volker's talk earlier today when he talked about the RFC process and how PHP is developed. There was a time when the PHP project did not have a standardized, formalized RFC process. And it still is very far from how standardized and formalized these processes are for other similar projects. Basically, somebody wanted to bring a new feature to the language, they implemented it, and without asking anyone, they could just commit it, and that was accepted practice at the time. Usually, though, they discussed this with others and got some agreement, but there was no real voting, there was no consensus on for what type of features do we need a vote, when do we not need a vote, and then one day, somebody new comes to the mailing list and it does not say, hey, PHP is stupid if you do not implement this great idea that I have, which was very common at the time. Like, I need this, and if you don't give me that, I will stop using your language, which is not really productive on any level. So Stefan Ma came to the mailing list and said, okay, I have learned about this language feature in another language. I think this language feature, it can be very useful. I have designed how this language feature could be implemented in PHP along the lines of what some people call the PHP spirit, how PHP adopts and adapts ideas from other ecosystems. I have written a specification, I have written documentation, I have written tests, and I have a proof of concept implementation, but please give me feedback because my C is not good enough, I think, and my understanding of the PHP internals are not good enough, I think. So there may be problems, memory leaks, performance issues, whatever. Please give me feedback, and then the result of that was that more and more people working on PHP said, okay, wow, this is how we want to work from now on. For these type of changes, changing or extending the syntax of PHP, we want something like this. Not necessarily the implementation bit, as Volker mentioned in his presentation, but please come to us with a motivation, an argument why this would be valuable, show us how this could be used, show us the impact, show us the consequences of implementing this. And then, of course, it's nice if you come with the implementation, but if we agree on this is useful, we will find somebody who implements that. And this was rather beneficial. Shipping that feature took some time because at the time the PHP project was working towards PHP 6. And if you have never heard about PHP 6, again, I envy you, because that was, at least at times, a dark time when we were working on PHP 6, and eventually said, no, we stopped working on PHP 6. And this equation, if you will, was very popular at some point when we decided to ditch PHP 6 and said basically, okay, we release everything that was planned for PHP 6 minus the one big thing that would have been in PHP 6, which was the Unicode support, and release that as PHP 5.3. And ever since PHP 5.4, we have this steady and reliable cadence of one version of PHP with new features every year in the fall. In the beginning, around, I was about to say the Turkey Fest, but Thanksgiving, that's the right name. And then some people realized, oh, putting it in the week of Thanksgiving, that is problematic because some people will be on vacation that should not be on vacation when we make that release. So it's now more or less always in the same calendar week towards the middle or end of November. And that seems to work out pretty good. 2009, PHP Storm came about. And my first reaction to PHP Storm was, oh God, no, please no, not another IDE. Because up until then, every IDE that I tried made me less productive than I was without an IDE. Up until 2009, I was using, so back then I already was no longer using Windows, so I was not using UltraEdit anymore, so I was using Linux, but I was using gedit, which is a very simple text editor from the GNOME desktop, which only had syntax highlighting, no autocomplete, no nothing. And up until PHP Storm came along, all other IDEs, whether they were open source or commercial products, they felt clunky and made me less productive, and PHP Storm changed that. Since then, so I started using it mostly because Arne convinced me, hey, you really need to try that because this is better than everything that you tried so far. And because he's Arne and because I trust him, I tried it and I do not regret doing that. And a couple of months later, I could no longer imagine working without PHP Storm. And I'm not saying that because I'm paid by PHP Storm. I'm not, but because it's the truth. The two people that are highlighted here started working around that time on Composer, which was it's hard to do archaeology on when the first release of PHP of Composer was. I can tell you when the first Composer stable release was made, but that was years after people started using Composer, because initially for a couple of years you used Snapshot of Composer, and that had as version the SHA-1 of the Git commit at which the snapshot was made. There was no tag. Which scared me a bit. So in 2011 and 2012, I was not using Composer. Around that time, Laravel was also released. And around that time, this guy started contributing to PHP. That's Nikita. He was studying. No, when he started, he was still in high school. He wrote most of the compiler for PHP 7 and contributed a lot to the runtime improvements of PHP 7 and later PHP 8. These days, he's working on LLVM and Rust and other languages, but he still maintains PHP Parser, which is the backbone of a lot of static analysis tools like PHP Stan. 2014, we are slowly but steadily coming to the present. Facebook was probably the biggest user of PHP in the world, and they wanted to optimize their application, and they had reached a point where they couldn't improve the performance of their application anymore by sticking to the standard PHP runtime, so they created their own different iterations of PHP runtimes, and that was the kick in the butt that the PHP project needed to focus on performance again. And that all started with this email from Dimitri to the mailing list, hey, I'm working on something that already gives like 6 times speed up, and this is what later became PHP 7. Of course, 6 times speed up is very rare. You get that if you do crazy things like me and implement a ray tracer in PHP. That's not what PHP is meant for, but I like doing crazy things sometimes. But this is what led to PHP 7. 2012, PHP CS Fixer was released, the tool that I use today for formatting my code. PHP 5.6 was released, which brought some initial performance benefits, like most of the performance improvements that could be made without breaking backwards compatibility. That was 75% faster than PHP 5.0. That was already noticeable, but not as much as PHP 7, which was shipped 10 years ago, which in real-world application brought somewhere between 1.5 and 4 times performance boost. 2016, we finally have the first tag of Composer and the Composer 1.0 release, including a funny eBay auction that was going on where you could buy a floppy disk that was gold and had the signatures of Jordi and Niels on it, with the far of the Composer binary. Back then, it still fit on a standard floppy disk. Yes, and 2016 is also the year where we start seeing significant work being done on static analysis and type checking in the PHP world. First was Fan, which is something that Rasmus built inside Etsy to analyze the code base of Etsy. They later open sourced that. Matt Brown at Vimeo.com did something very similar, built a tool to do type checking and static analysis on the Vimeo code base. Later, they open sourced that. It's also when Andre started working on PHP Stan, which is what I use these days for static analysis of my PHP code. A year later, people started working on infection for mutation testing. Nowadays, infection even combines PHPUnit mutation testing and PHP Stan to give even more useful results. So if you have never looked into mutation testing, have a look at that to improve your tests. 5 years ago, PHP 8 was released. Under normal workloads and in default configuration meaning you have opcache and opcache bytecode caching and opcache bytecode optimizations enabled, which is what you should always do. You get up to 20% improved performance. You can turn on the just-in-time compiler, and then in theory, it gets even faster, but I have not seen that yet. Not in production for a web environment. I do see it a lot in command line applications if you use a long-running process like a PHP Stan or a PHPUnit execution. There it can actually give you benefit. It's also the year when Composer 2 was released, and only recently, like a couple of weeks ago, packages.org turned off support for Composer 1 metadata. So 5 years, I think, should be long enough of a time window to upgrade something as important as the tool with which you manage your dependencies. 2021, 4 years ago, the PHP Foundation was founded, because up until then, there was no entity that funded development of PHP development. Yeah, by now, 4 years later, and I say we because I'm part of the team that helped found the foundation, and I'm also a member of the board of the PHP Foundation. Now we pay each month 11 developers for working on the PHP language and the PHP runtime. One of the things that we did as the PHP Foundation last year that is special is that for the very first time in PHP's history, there was a structured and professional security audit of the C code of the PHP runtime. That was paid for by the German government. So if we have German taxpayers in the audience, myself included, thank you. That's a good use of our tax money. And that was like, in total, they gave us like 240, 250,000, and a little bit over 100,000 was spent on the security audit. And a lot of really useful information came out of that. And I would have been very disappointed if they had not found any security issues. They did. All of them have been fixed. But what the findings and how they presented them also helped improve preventing security issues in the future, because processes were changed, new tools were introduced into the CI/CD pipelines. That was really, really good. This year, Pi came out, the PHP installer for extensions, the replacement for Peckle, based on the packages ecosystem. Also good. Very happy that this happened. Also sponsored by the Sovereign Tech Fund and the PHP Foundation, because they are interested. The Sovereign Tech Fund is interested in safe supply chains, and part of the supply chain is the language runtime, and especially extensions that they install for the PHP runtime. And thanks to cryptographic hashes and signatures and attestations, you can make sure and have trust into the extensions that you install using Pi for your PHP runtime. You know where they are coming from, that they are coming from only trusted sources and so on, and that is good. And this is, whether you know it or not, whether you believe what the cloud companies tell you, because at the bottom there's a hardware layer. There still is hardware required to run your software. Whether or not you see that hardware or know where the hardware is, that is a different issue. But this is what the full stack looks like. This is your supply chain. Yeah, and if we only focus on this, this is part of your supply chain. The language, PHP, tools like Composer, PHP Stand, PHPUnit, frameworks like Symfony or Laravel, libraries that you are using. Your business would not work the way it does without these, because without these, you would have to implement the functionality that they provide yourself. And supply chain not only means, hey, there are potential risks in security and things like that if you not properly manage that, but it also comes with the responsibility of sponsoring your supply chain, because you rely on it and it's in your own best interest that these software components are maintained. And because I always wear at least 2 hats, I give you 2 recommendations where you could start sponsoring the PHP ecosystem. Sponsor the PHP language itself through the PHP Foundation. That is possible through the website that you find on the left. Or sponsor my work on PHPUnit if you think what I do is important and valuable to what you do. Or do both. Yes, in an ideal world, all of this would be automated, and you would just say, hey, I want to spend this amount of money on the PHP ecosystem, and then one payment, and that would be distributed to critical infrastructure within the PHP ecosystem, but we are not there yet. But one can dream, right? So with that, I would like to thank you for coming to this keynote. I hope that this historic journey was at least to some degree of interest to you and entertaining, maybe, but being a German and being entertaining, that's sometimes mutually exclusive, and I include myself in that, at least sometimes. This presentation has a home on the web, so if you're interested in getting the presentation material, or probably more interesting, an article that recollects everything that I told you now, and some more information, even just go to that website and you will find that there. And with that, thank you.